So we're welcome everyone. We are in our second session on the question of public reading of Torah, and you know, well, I will comment that generally speaking, what I try and do on Monday nights is dig deeper into sort of an issue of Jewish tradition, an artifact of Jewish tradition of learning, a deep dive into text. We, spent weeks reading the Song of Songs and the stories of King David. And on Wednesday night, a little more surface view of issues, Jewish issues. So we do have this custom, as many of you know, that we read Torah publicly at services. And when I say publicly, it's really a ritual reading. So it's not just reading Torah, a section of Torah from a book, which would be called a Pentateuch or a Chumash, or even from Sefaria, but there is a ritual reading from a scroll, which has, that'd be a whole other subject, which would be very interesting, is how a kosher Torah scroll is prepared. And, it's a good opportunity to remind you that the Hebrew word kosher means fit or appropriate. It doesn't only apply to food. So a Torah scroll that has been handwritten by a scribe on the skin of a kosher animal and meets, probably a dozen or 24 other requirements is then kosher and fit for ritual reading in a synagogue. And those readings take place at certain times and occasions. So always on Shabbat. So the tradition is on Shabbat morning, the scroll is read from, the Torah is read from a scroll. On Shabbat afternoon, remember there's traditionally three services a day in Jewish tradition. The morning one is Shacharit. So a Shacharit and Mincha on Shabbat morning, Torah scroll is read. On holidays, the Torah scroll is read. And on Mondays and Thursdays, the Torah is read from a scroll. And the reason for Mondays and Thursdays is that they were in these times that we're going to discuss, they were market days. So while the Jews were in a town going to market and collecting, there would be, of course, if they were traditional Jews, they would be going to synagogue.
Sorry.
I'm gonna mute you. If they were traditional Jews, they would go to services on every morning. And then on Mondays and Thursdays, there would be more of them in town for a market. And so they selected those days to read Torah. And I would say in Orthodox synagogues and conservative synagogues, those are the times when Torah is traditionally read. So we started reading about some of the origins of this, and there are some references in the Torah to reading Torah on Sukkot. And now we're going to get into the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So I'm going to share screen, and I presume you can see the screen. So yeah, so we have one of the in the ordering of the books in a Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are almost at the end, and they are the story of the Jews returning from the exile in Babylon to the Holy Land. And there's the story of Ezra, and Ezra is a scribe, Nehemiah is a military leader, of trying to basically reorganize the Jewish population in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land, and building walls to protect the city, and as we'll see, instituting a public reading of Torah. So, if there are no comments or suggestions.
Well, I just want to say, Rabbi, my brothers had their bar mitzvah on Thursday. It was never a big party, but they had their bar mitzvah on Thursdays.
It was never a big what party, did you say?
Yeah, they never made like a big deal out of it.
Yeah, so a lot of people will we'll talk about sometimes what they'll call a tefillin ceremony. How many of you have ever heard of that on a Monday or a Thursday?
You told us that last week. That's how I
Oh,
know it.
okay, okay. Oh, well, I could ask Julie to repeat it, but I won't. Yeah. So why would you have a bar mitzvah ceremony in modern times on a Monday or Thursday? First, you're reading from the Torah, so
Yeah.
perfectly okay to have the child come up and read from the Torah. Shorter Torah portion, no haftorah, all of which is good news to the child. And you can take pictures because it's not Shabbat. And you can, if it's a very traditional synagogue, you can have the sound system on and so on. So I've been to bar and bat mitzvahs in conservative synagogues where there will be a ceremony, and they call it a tefillin ceremony because on Shabbat a man does not put on tefillin, but on Monday mornings and Thursday mornings he and in a conservative synagogue she would also put on tefillin. I don't know if any of you saw this sort of bombarded my Facebook page, a bunch of Orthodox Jews, two Orthodox Jews, putting tefillin on a Santa Claus in a department store. Evidently, Santa was Jewish, and so these guys went up to Santa and asked him, "Are you Jewish?" And he said yes. And before you know it, we have something I've never seen before, which is Santa wearing tefillin.
About it, it's best.
Yes, and I'm sure he had a full beard, so he even looked Jewish, right? Okay, and he had a nice yarmulke on, red and pointy, so it's perfect. Okay, so would someone like to read from Ezra Hachel?
I'll read, Rabbi.
Thank you, Joanne.
The most elaborate Hakel-like reading appears in the book of Nehemiah is significant not just as a possible example of this mitzvah, but because of its place in the history of public Torah reading, to this day a key feature of the Jewish prayer service.
Okay, so I'll just comment. The word Hakel comes in the Torah. It means to gather, and it leads to a word which is very common, which is kahal, which is a very common Hebrew word meaning congregation. And this guy's name in English would be Nehemiah. In Hebrew would be Nehemiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah.
It's funny. I've always heard that name pronounced Nehemiah.
Nehemiah.
Nehemiah in the South. That's
what did I say? Nehemiah. Yeah, Nehemiah sounds.
Nehemiah.
Yeah. I always think of it as Nehemiah, but that's all right. Okay, Joanne, you can continue.
Okay, Ezra and Nehemiah. The Bible describes the careers of two great Jewish leaders arriving in Judea around the mid-5th century BCE during the period of the return Shavot Zion. One of these leaders is Ezra the scribe, who received a royal appointment as overseer of the temple administration and Jewish affairs throughout the 20th satrap of Eber-Nahar. The text describes Ezra as dedicated to Torah study.
Okay, Alan, you have a question or comment. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, just elaborating. When it says the return, the period of the return, that means after 586 BCE, yes. And this event is described not in Babylonia but back in Israel, right?
Yeah, the book takes place in Israel,
right?
And the history briefly is the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in the date that I always see is 586 BCE.
Correct. Me too.
And then the Jewish leadership, not all the Jews, but the Jewish leadership is carried off to Babylonia. And in the very shortly thereafter, Persia conquers Babylonia, and Persia is fairly tolerant to many of its captured nations. So Persia allows those Jews who want to return to the Holy Land to return to the Holy Land and rebuild the temple. So when we talk about the second temple, we're talking about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's about like 530 or so BCE.
That's what I thought. It's about 50 years after
about 50 years.
about that. Okay, that's.
And then, of course, many Jews stayed in Babylonia, and Babylon, which of course now at this point is Persia, becomes a major center of Jewish life, for the next probably 1,500 years. And so the major Talmud is the Babylonian Talmud, written in Bavel, and not in the Holy Land.
Thank you.
Okay, so Joanne.
For Ezra had dedicated himself to study the teaching of Hashem so as to observe it and to teach laws and rules to Israel.
Right. So we're quoting from the book of Ezra.
The second leader was the governor of Judea, Nehemiah ben Hakaliah, whose administrative prowess, as well as his indomitable personality, allowed him to have great influence in shaping Judean society. The public Torah reading. On the first of the 7th month, which according to my chronology came out in September 443 BCE at the end of a sabbatical year, throngs of people had congregated at the wide plaza at the eastern gate of the temple compound for the traditional sacrificial service of the new year that would be conducted by the priests and Levites. They request that Ezra bring out the Torah and read it to them.
So here's the quote from the text.
When the 7th month arrived, the Israelites being settled in their towns, the entire people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the teaching of Moses with which the Lord had charged Israel.
Okay, and some of the Hebrew is instructive. It's Sefer Torat Moshe. So we definitely have what's translated as teaching is Torah. And so in this, my understanding here, and I'm certainly not a scholar in this world, but this is the first time that we actually see people talking about bringing the scroll of Torah. So scholarly accounts that I've come across trace the idea that the Torah reached the form that we understand it today in this time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Alan. You're muted, Alan.
Sorry about that again. The Watergate, that sounds familiar, like it's one of the, contemporary names, not Damascus, not, is that Watergate one of the,
well, it's, it got Nixon into trouble.
It's when the Democratic headquarters were.
Yeah,
I knew I couldn't resist that.
So it's the other thing which caught my eye is the eastern gate of the temple. Now, in a time of Ezra and Nehemiah, we didn't have the temple as you envision it, as this grand. Well, first of two things. In the Talmud, there's a description of what the rebuilt temple looked like, and there is a comment that people that had remembered what the Temple of Solomon looked like, the first temple, and saw the rebuilt temple would cry because the rebuilt temple was such a poor substitute. Much later on, around the year 30 or so, we have 30, I think, Common Era. We maybe before the Common Era, but sometime around then, we have Herod building up the Temple Mount and building a magnificent temple. But the interesting thing is here it says at the eastern gate of the temple. So the eastern gate of the temple would be opposite where we now see the Western Wall. If you have a vision in your head about what the Temple Mount looks like in Jerusalem, so it would be facing what is now the Mount of Olives. And that's where they are. And evidently there was a gate called the Water Gate, but I'm not familiar.
I've seen that sign when I've wandered around in that area. That's
so that gate may still exist. It's probably bricked up. There's not that many gates that are still open. Jerry.
Yeah, what's interesting here in this text is the scroll of the teaching of Moses. The entire people assembled as one man, and they asked Ezra to bring, which is in the commentary technically, but the scroll of the teaching of Moses.
No, actually, I think we usually have this idea that the bold type is actually text and the other type is not text. This is all text. I think the bold is what the author is highlighting.
Even better. Okay, great,
yeah,
great.
yeah.
I got it zoomed out, so I can't really see it too
Yeah,
well. But
so
anyway,
yeah,
so
it's Lifnei Sha'ar
but that
Hamayim.
was the sorry, that's that. Let me just keep rolling here. So
Yeah, go ahead.
it looks like, if they're saying to bring the scroll, right, then they don't have it, right? They don't have one, a scroll or the scroll, whatever it is, and they're looking to hear about this teaching, this great teaching of Moses, which when you think of Moses, you're thinking of not Tanakh, but you're thinking of, the 5 books, right? So it's interesting to me that they're saying, hey, we want to learn from this scroll. We want to know
Right.
about this scroll. Can you tell us about this? Can you teach us this? And this is a very important moment because the people are looking out and want to understand now that they've come back to Jerusalem. How do we work in this place? Do you think somebody here, we're talking about 40, 50 years, whatever it is later, it's similar to the time that the Hebrews spent in the desert. It's all new. It's 2 generations later, right? Of the people that went there. Many of these people were born in Babylon, right?
Yes, yes.
Probably the bulk of them. And so they know very little about where they've just landed, and this is a very critical moment in charting their future destiny in this new land to them.
Yeah, and remember, it's Ezra the scribe, so it's Ezra HaSofer. So he's a sofer, and Lehaviv to bring the sefer. So they're asking the sofer to bring a sefer, the scroll. A sefer can also mean book. The Hebrew word for scroll is actually Megillah, but they're asking him to bring the book of the Torah of Moshe.
The Torah the scroll is the Torah, correct? Torah and scroll are the same thing.
No,
Torah?
no. So
no.
So well, in this context, it's the same thing. But a scroll can be a scroll of the Book of Esther. It can be a scroll of anything. The word scroll is a generic term, and then Torah is also another term. But in this case, it's certainly it is a book of Torah, and in this time, it's very likely that it was written on a scroll because everything was handwritten, and I don't think they had books like we think of them today, which are typically called codex. I think that'll come more than 1,000 years later.
It was all scrolls at that time.
It was all scrolls.
Yes. So yeah.
Okay, so let's continue, Joanne.
The date is the 1st of the 7th month, as opposed to the holiday of Sukkot, 15th to the 22nd of the month, the time Deuteronomy instructs Hakel to take place. While the reading was seemingly done at the people's request, much of the planning of this innovative event must have come under Ezra's direction and religious sanction.
Okay, so now we have from the book of Nehemiah.
On the 1st day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the teaching before the congregation, men and women, and all who could listen with understanding. He read from it facing the square before the water gate, from the first light until midday, to the men and the women and those who could understand. The ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the teaching.
Yeah, so this kind of like, Jerry, what you're describing. I don't know if your hand is still up because you want to add, or you just have forgotten to put it down. Yeah, forgotten to put it down. Okay, let's continue.
The public reading here resonates with the description of Hakel, with its emphasis on Torah being read to the entire nation, even using the same root, albeit in noun form, as that of the verb Hakel. And yet the text does not explicitly say that it was being done in accordance with Deuteronomy 31. In addition, the description of the audience is slightly different. Whereas in Deuteronomy, the Torah is read to men, women, and children, and the stranger in your community, and Josiah reads the Torah to the entire nation from young to old. Ezra reads to men, women, and those who can understand. Whether this is a reference to those who understand Hebrew or more likely to older children, the list seems less expansive than that of Deuteronomy and Kings. Innovative techniques. As part of this Hakel ceremony, the story in Nehemiah introduces a number of features to make the ceremony more effective. Wooden tower. Ezra stands on a wooden tower that was built to solve the problem of acoustics. Ezra the scribe stood upon a wooden tower they made for the purpose.
Yeah, one of the things, I can't remember where I came across this, But in ancient times, without microphones, the number of people that an individual could speak to was fairly limited. I think roughly a few thousand, depending on how good the acoustics are, and in the tower and so on. So you don't speak to 100,000 people. Just kind of interesting to keep in mind.
The stage, or to use the later Hebrew word bima, derived from Greek, served the additional purpose of giving the people visual contact, focusing on the ceremony. It is mentioned in the Mishnah quoted above as a standard part of the king's reading.
Okay, Bryson and Erwin.
Yeah, the Greeks figured that one out, and that's why they conducted their not ceremonies, but their plays and all of their public announcements and such with a stone or a rock background behind them. All right, so that half of the sound wouldn't just go away from the people; it would bounce off and reinforce, and they also they learned something about a curved surface focusing the sound better. So they were no dummies.
Oh, clearly not dummies. A lot of times if you visit old Roman theaters in the
Europe,
Holy Land, well, in Europe, but my experience is in the Holy Land. In Caesarea, there's a theater, and there's always a demonstration by one of the tour guides of someone standing on the stage and speaking very quietly and being heard throughout the theater. Erwin.
My understanding is that, for instance, the stand was in the middle of the congregation. It wasn't in the front of them. And it's still, I think, in a Spanish Portuguese synagogue, still the rabbi stands in the middle of congregation. And read it. And also, I am sorry, the mile high city outside of the city, there is a big amphitheater made of red rocks where they don't use acoustics, and the entertainers standing in the front, and the acoustics are very, very good.
Yeah, you're saying they don't use artificial amplification.
No.
Yes. And also in the dome of the Capitol, there's always a demonstration where someone speaks facing the curved surface, as Bryce mentioned, literally in a whisper, and then in one spot on the other side, and people could hear it.
Yeah, it's a whispering gallery.
Yes.
And in fact, up on the streets of San Francisco, they had one. It was a big parabolic cement thing. If you had somebody stand there and very, very long distance away, several hundred yards, you whispered, and your friend several hundred yards away could hear everything you said.
Yeah, so acoustics are a wonderful thing.
Grand Central Station has the same thing, Bryce.
So, but responding more to what Erwin was saying, synagogue design, which now is going to be a few hundred years after this, we start seeing synagogues around the turn of the millennia. The reading area was typically either in the middle or maybe toward the front. Typically and also as Erwin mentioned, in the Spanish design and in the Sephardic design, the scrolls are on the eastern wall or the wall facing Jerusalem, depending on where you are. And the reading table, the bima, is in the center of the congregation. The habit of making it more like a stage presentation I think is typically post World War II in Reform and conservative synagogues.
The place called in Arizona the Red Rock Amphitheater, and it's maybe 10 miles from
okay, let's not get too far off subject on acoustics. Jerry.
Yeah, so back to what's going on here. So if you imagine you get this, called a courtyard because it's effectively what it is, and he's up on this tower, which was actually a pretty good idea because it's a visual effect. They're talking about the acoustics, but it's probably more visual than acoustic, right? Everybody has to see him, seeing the person saying the thing.
And that's what we're going to see in the next text.
Oh, okay, right. So, but it makes you realize that this is not a very big crowd, right? I mean, this is not millions of people. It's not even hundreds of thousands of people. It's tens of thousands of people at the most. And that's who the leadership was that came back to Jerusalem, and they were a small number in a place that was, there was a lot of people around. So this was not a given thing that this was going to, take and they were going to survive. They did have the benefit that, you pointed out that they were sent there by the Persians. Well, there was a reason for that. They were sent there to manage the territory, right? Collect tax, etc., and basically be the local representatives. Persians did that in a lot of areas. It wasn't just there. They did that all over the Middle East. And so, so they had some backing, from Persia, of course, while Persia lasted. So they had a little bit of security from that. But this was a, very interesting thing that these people would want to understand this, so that they can, move their culture not only back to what it was, but to move it forward as well.
And it would be interesting. I have no idea how much of this is known about, how much Jewish practice survived during the expulsion in Babylon.
It's not even, if you look at Yonatan Adler's comments, it's not even how much survived, it's how much were they even doing in the first place, right?
That's another question. But I remember very vividly, when I was a pulpit rabbi in Camarillo, having a family move in of Soviet Jews who had moved to, they got out of the Soviet Union, and they wound up in California, and they knew they were Jewish, and they were kind of mid-30s, late 30s with young children, and they knew nothing about their Judaism. Right. And if you think about it, it was also probably like a 50, 70 year period under communism where Judaism, in this case, was actively suppressed. But
it's a great analogy.
But they signed up for an introduction to Judaism class, both mom and dad, because they said, although we know we're Jewish and we suffered a lot from being Jewish, we were absolutely clueless about what that meant.
So here it is. Ezra's going to do the introduction to Judaism right now.
Exactly. Okay. Without benefit of Zoom. So Joanne, showing the scroll.
Showing the scroll, Ezra opens the Torah scroll in view of all the people, symbolically indicating that it is an open book meant for all the people, regardless of gender, age, or status. Ezra opened the scroll in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people. Standing or silence. As Ezra prepares to read, the people stand up. As he opened it, all the people stood up.
And actually, so I'll comment. As you know, my understanding of this, and I don't have access to the original halacha, is when the Torah is out and moving, it is customary to rise in honor of the Torah. So, you take the Torah from the ark, you have a circle around the congregation. Once the Torah is laid down for, on the reading table, then people can sit down. So that sounds like that's hearkening back to this moment.
Okay. This is probably where the Hagba comes from.
Yeah, I know you love Chagba and Midrash, but I don't think we have a clue about Chagba yet. You were talking about lifting the Torah, but the idea is that people want to see it. Yes. Okay, let's continue, Joanne.
All right, I want to ask you what LXX. What?
Okay. Oh boy, you.
70.
Okay, you want the 2-minute explanation, the 5-minute explanation, or the 20-minute explanation?
I'll take the 2-minute.
Okay, so LXX is a Roman numeral. So now here's the audience participation program.
70. L is 50, X is 10.
Very good. 70.
70.
So, very good. So it is a reference to a very important translation called the Septuagint, which refers to 70. And the Septuagint is the translation of the Hebrew Bible, first the Torah and then the full Bible, into Greek. And it's a Jewish translation. And the date usually associated with is about 200 BCE. Why is it called the 70? Because of the tradition, which I don't believe for a minute, that 70 scholars were independently given the job of translating from Hebrew into Greek, and all 70 translations were exactly the same. Therefore, the translations themselves were divinely inspired. Therefore, you don't have to go back to the Hebrew. You can stick with the Greek. And in some churches, particularly Greek Orthodox, you will see English translations of the Septuagint rather than of the Hebrew. Anyway, so the translation that we just read, he opened it and all the people stood up. So that's what the reference here is. This translation is the standard interpretation of the book already found in the Septuagint and in most modern translations of the Bible, such as the New Jewish Publication Society and the New Revised Standard Version. I can never remember which. I think that's a Christian version. So, but the interesting point here is going to be after the word nevertheless. So, Joanne.
Nevertheless, some traditional commentaries understand the term as stopped talking, i.e. they were silent. In fact, Rava bar Rav Huna learns from this verse that it is forbidden to speak during the synagogue Torah reading ceremony.
Okay, so we're silent. The people stood up. I don't know where they would get the idea, not that they were silent, but Ibn Ezra is the classic translator and commentator on grammar. So anyway, so that's a translation issue. Okay.
Blessing after this, he consecrated the act of Torah reading with a blessing. Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, with hands upraised. Then they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves before the Lord with their faces to the ground.
And of course, you know that in a synagogue, both before the reading and after the reading, there is a blessing, and we also see the word Amen, which is in the Hebrew right here. And as I often mention, Amen comes from related to the concept of emunah, which means faith. It's so funny to me when I'm in a Christian church, particularly like Protestant, and where there's a lot of amens. I mean, the pastor will sort of ask, "Can I get an amen?" Or the pastor will make a point and he'll ask the word "amen," basically asking the question, "Do you agree with me?" And people will shout amen, and so it's it's fun. And then I will go up privately to ask the pastor if he knows what the meaning of the word amen is, and I have yet to find someone who knows it.
And so, I have a granddaughter. Her name is Amuna.
Emunah, which means faith.
Yeah.
And so we have that word in English, both as a noun and a name, faith. So Emunah is a beautiful name. Alan, you need to unmute.
This Emunah, is it connected in the same root to truth, emek?
That's a good question. I would think they might be related, but I don't know.
Okay.
What you do is there are two letters that are common, the aleph and the mem, and that the taf often sneaks in. So it wouldn't surprise me if they're related, but I'm not enough of a Hebrew scholar.
Just thought of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a book right over there which would help me, but I'm not going to interrupt. Okay, let's continue, Joanne, at his every move.
As at every move, the people responded by various physical gestures of acknowledgement, such as standing, raising their hand, genuflecting, and bowing. Translators. As noted above, Ezra's reading was aimed at those who understood. This was because the audience would certainly have included newcomers from Babylon who spoke Aramaic but could not understand the Hebrew of the Torah. In order to overcome this language barrier, he appointed groups of Levites as teachers, called people who understand, or rather who taught, and who would translate and explain the Torah reading.
So I want to read the Hebrew. The Hebrew is mevinim. And so I bet you all know the Yiddish term. It's actually a Hebrew term, maven, right? You remember, know the word maven? What was it?
Yeah.
There was a commercial, the something maven. It was anybody
Was
remember
a
that?
maven.
Yes.
He's a
So
maven.
the word
English.
maven comes from the word from those who understand. A very common.
It's in English too.
It is a Hebrew word which is so common that it has entered the English language. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And there's a Hebrew phrase which is very common, which is hamevin yavin. The one who understands will understand, as though it's sort of an inside bit of knowledge. Alan.
Is maven the word you're saying? It sounds familiar to the part of the Tanakh referred to as the writings. Am I misstating that?
That's Navi.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So the Tanakh, the first part is Torah,
right,
which means Torah. The second part is Nevi'im, which means prophets.
That's the one.
And the third part is Ketuvim, which means writings.
Right.
So
That's
yeah,
right.
it's not related to this
it's
word.
not prophets. Okay, thank you.
No. Okay, and then we have a bunch of names. I'll read that. Yeshua Bani Sheriba Yamin. I probably easier to read it in Hebrew. Akuv Shabtai Hodia Maasya Kalita. Oh boy. Azari Jozaba, I'm not going to struggle with the name Pelilia, and the Levites explained the teaching to the people. While the people stood in their places, they read from the scroll of the teaching of God, translating it and giving the sense so that they understood the reading. So I'll read one more sentence. Of particular note is that Ezra uses the term mikra innovatively, reading a sacred text, thereby creating the word mikra, which means a biblical text. And let's see if there's anything interesting in the Hebrew. Okay, there's the use of the term mikra. But I think what he's focusing on here is translating, and I can't remember if they're going to go into this, but if I remember the tradition correctly, that someone would read a little Hebrew and then a person would translate it into Aramaic. And so because most of the people in the audience would understand Aramaic as a spoken language and not understand Hebrew. Okay, let's continue, Joanne.
Ezra's Sukkot reading. Ezra does another public Torah reading 2 weeks later on Sukkot. He read from the scroll of the teaching of God each day, from the first to the last day. They celebrated the festival 7 days, and there was a solemn gathering on the 8th as prescribed.
Yeah, so the first reading that we're talking about was on the first day, which is Rosh Hashanah, and now on Sukkot, which is 2 weeks later. And here they're calling it the teaching of God, Torah Elohim. And let's continue.
This is not presented explicitly as Hakel, though it does take place at the right time. Ezra reads from the Torah every day on Sukkot, continuing his campaign of Torah education among the Judeans. Precedent for rabbinic Torah reading. Ezra's public Torah reading on the first of the 7th month, Yom Zikaron Torah, and continued on every day of Sukkot seems to be an application of the Hakel ceremony. This sets a precedent of reading the Torah on the other festival days, including Shabbat, Rosh Hadesh, Yom Kippur, and the Religim, the 3 pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot.
Yeah, so just a comment, Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, is the first day of every month, which is a minor holiday in the Jewish calendar. And Regalim literally means legs, and it refers to people using their legs to go on a pilgrimage, where to Jerusalem, where the commandment is that every adult Jewish male has to go to, is commanded to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year. Whether they did or not is another question. Bryce.
Yeah, would Ezra have gotten any pushback from his compatriots or from the power structure on the idea of reading Torah to the people? I'm wondering, that there's often in many religions a separation between the people and the holy folk.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's been emphasized now a couple of times, both in the earlier references to reading Torah and then to the Ezra references, that it was read to the entire people, from the young to the old, and so on. So it is, I would say, an artifact of early Judaism, which continues into Judaism, throughout the ages, is that everyone is required to be literate, to be able to read and study Torah. Now, of course, until very recently, when they said everyone, they meant every male. But it's not simply limited to the priests and holy people, as Bryce was mentioning. Jerry.
Yeah, so one thing per Bryce's question, so what is Ezra's relationship here? And the people would have known that he fought, to get them back there, right? Then there was documents that went back and forth between him and the royalty in Persia to set up this whole thing and how they were going to arrange and all that. And so I think, just my opinion was, he would have been looked on very favorably, as somebody that returned them to the lands, because they want to get back to their lands, because, well, then they would have land ownership and the benefits of land ownership again, just in a practical sense. That's not even the emotional or the spiritual sense. So, so I think that they would have been very happy about this. And if you look at the beginning of this section, it says that the people asked, for him to read the Torah. I think, I'm not paraphrasing, but wanted him to. So this seems to be this pull. They wanted this, right? So I don't know if that helps answer your question, Bryce.
And I also,
it's not so much that I was thinking in terms of the people, and it's not a problem of the people wanting to get it. I was thinking about quite often in many religious hierarchies, the top people are restrictive in access. You see, like, we're the only ones that can touch this. We're the only ones that can do this, and so forth.
Yeah.
And so
they're definitely in this case, though. The first problem is they don't speak Hebrew, right? So it sounds like, so that's why he's talking about interpreting. It's actually the modern form, the way Hebrew is read and then translated and then interpreted, probably started right here, right? So
and the other. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please.
No, I'm going to say, also responding, scrolling back up through the article a little bit, Ezra's a priest, Ezra HaKohen. So, he's both a scribe and a priest. And in the sort of the battle that takes place a few hundred years later for who is going to survive and lead Judaism, you have a battle between a power issue between the Sadducees, who represented the priests, which were a hereditary closed group. You couldn't become a priest. You were either born the son of a priest or not. And the Pharisees, who become the rabbis, which is purely a meritocracy. Namely, you become a rabbi by virtue of your learning. And I would say Ezra sort of is in both worlds. He is both a priest and a scribe, and he is bringing the reading to everyone.
That's what I was wondering about. You see, whether there was any kind of a power struggle at all involved with the opening up. That's all.
Yeah. So I don't know if that was the case in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It certainly becomes two major movements in Judaism, around the time of Jesus, where you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and there's clearly a power struggle there. And ultimately, with the destruction of the temple, the priests become all but irrelevant.
But don't forget about the whole Hasmonean period in between those two. Would be a really big reset there. So
yes, and then you have the priests putting themselves in charge of the government. So there's all kinds of fun and games going on, but ultimately the priesthood becomes largely irrelevant with the destruction of the temple. So the main function of the priest, which is to sacrifice animals, disappears. Erwin.
Yeah, how many people understand the Hebrew when you are reading it now in the congregation? And I don't know how many years ago, the Christian church stopped reading the Bible in Latin, and they turned it into English to have a better understanding with the congregation.
Well, what they turned it into was the vernacular. So if you were in Spanish speaking country, it would be the Gospels would be read and the Mass would be pronounced in Spanish and in Italian and whatever. Yeah, so that's actually, to me, it's an interesting question.
That's just recent, by the way. That, I mean,
yes.
I remember when the Catholics decided to start doing that. So they'd been conducting their services in Latin for 1,500 years. So, you know, there's some resistance to change there.
Yes. And I remember going to a I think it was a Greek, I think it was an Orthodox, Christian Orthodox service, and the entire liturgy and everything was all in English. And it kind of bothered me. I like the mystery of having it in a foreign language. And Erwin, I would guess in most synagogues, I'll talk about this country, most people would not be familiar enough to understand the Hebrew, even though they may be familiar enough to recite it and read it. But I don't think Hebrew literacy is very widespread in this country.
Unfortunately, even a bar or bat mitzvah, girls or boys do not understand what they're reading.
Yes, because the mitzvah is in the doing, not necessarily the understanding.
In Israel, Rabbi, they speak Hebrew and they understand it. They understand it. Definitely. We don't here in our country.
Right.
But
and I would say that phenomenon of most people speaking and understanding Hebrew is fairly recent even in Israel. I mean, that's a movement that starts in the mid 1800s. So Hebrew was largely a dead language from about the turn of the millennia, maybe a little before, until the 1850s, when Hebrew was people used it in prayer, and probably many people understood what they were praying, and but they didn't use it in conversing and asking about what are we having for dinner, and it was consciously reintroduced into Israel by Ben Yehuda, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, in the mid 1800s.
Well, largely, my understanding is that Hebrew was in large part reconstructed. I mean, there are a lot of hapex legomenon. Is that the word?
Hapex legomenon is a word that appears only once in the Bible.
Exactly. There are a number of those in the Torah, and no one knows what the word is because there's no cross references to understand the Hebrew.
Well, but you get some context from the sentences, of course,
Yes. So you get context from the sentences, and then you also get context from other languages like Syriac, which are similar to Hebrew. So in trying to make informed guesses about what the word means, you get it. But there's also a probably much larger list of words that we need in modern language that aren't in the Bible at all. So one of Ben Yehuda's tasks. One of Ben Yehuda's tasks was to invent words. And this got started in the mid 1800s and continues today in an official proceeding. And sometimes people use the word and sometimes they don't. So for example, the Hebrew word for a taxi is monit. And I think most people just say taxi. And then you have words like, to fax, which is lefaxes. And the Hebrew word for banana is banana. And I can't remember if any of my Hebrew speakers are with me today. I don't think so. But anyway, so yeah, Hebrew is one of the many things that I am utterly fascinated with and by. Let's.
What were they speaking in Israel before Hebrew?
I'm sorry?
In Israel, what were they speaking before they took over?
So the Ashkenazim were largely speaking German and Yiddish and Russian.
Oh.
And the Sephardim were speaking Ladino and Spanish. And Hebrew was the language of prayer. And so as the Zionist congresses were getting together in the late 1800s, one of the issues that they addressed was, what should we use as our language? We ought to have one common language. And there were people pressing for German and Russian because so many people spoke those languages. And this guy Eliezer ben Yehuda was what is called in Hebrew Mishagala Davar, which means crazy about one thing. And his one thing that he was crazy about was Hebrew. So when he moved, I think from Poland, or maybe Russia, I can't remember, to the Holy Land with his wife, he forbade his wife, and then they had a child, from speaking anything other than Hebrew. And his child was the first native-born Hebrew speaker in 2,000 years.
Yeah, when he was in the room anyway,
Sorry?
When he was in the room anyway, as soon as he walked out of the room, they went back to whatever.
Yeah. So anyway, the story of Hebrew, another fascinating story. Okay, let's see if we can get through this fascinating story tonight. Precedent for rabbinic Torah reading.
Ezra's public Torah reading on the first of the 7th month, Yom Zikaron Teruah, and continued on every day of Sukkot, seems to be an application of Hakel ceremony. This sets a precedent of reading the Torah on the other festival days, including Shabbat, Rosh Hadesh, Yom Kippur, and the Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. As we have already seen, the ceremony became the model of the synagogue service, which flourished during the late Second Temple period. As an extension of this democratic innovation, overriding sacred space and time, the rabbis attributed to Ezra the public Torah reading outside the synagogue on the market days of Monday and Thursday. Hakel has essentially morphed into the Ezra inspired weekly Torah readings, yet it hasn't been entirely lost. In fact, the biblical Hakel ceremony has resurfaced in modern Israel, where the practice of Hakel has been renewed and takes place at the Kotel at the end of the sabbatical year.
Okay, interesting. Okay, if you're interested in stuff like this. So it is just about 8 o'clock. And any other thoughts or comments? On Wednesday, we will take up the description of the movements. And at that time, I will apologize to Alan Warshaw, who was correct that the patrilineal descent resolution did come in the time of Alexander Schindler. You were correct about that. But I actually researched when and why patrilineal descent came in and the logic behind matrilineal descent. And you will be amazed. I'll put it this way. I was amazed.
It'll be a good program.
Yeah, it's we'll discuss it next time. But let me put this tantalizer out there. Even today, in traditional Judaism, everything is patrilineal. Now, I know that's going to sound wrong, and tune in Wednesday to figure out why that is still true. It's actually fascinating to me. Jerry.
Yeah, so just going back to what we just talked about. So the public Torah readings, this is like an incredibly important thing, right? Because they came back and they did this public Torah. Now you saw that it wasn't, sorry, that's the cat hitting a keyboard, if you believe it. So it's hard to underestimate the importance of that this was to the people. And Ezra was incredibly important. And a lot of people, we could talk about this, but that the whole modern Torah, the way it was put together, a lot of it could come from, what Ezra's time, right? And, maybe Ezra rewrote some of it or had it written or whatever it is to enforce what he was trying to say. So, you know, I guess maybe we could, it's a little late now, but we could explore that in a little bit more depth if we wanted to at some other time, that it could be, Ezra could be at the leading edge of what modern Judaism became.
Yeah. So, and I also think about it as something, you know, the point that Bryce brought up, and that is in Judaism, the Torah and interpretation belongs to everyone. And it's not sort of a secret set of texts which are hidden away. I mean, there's some, you know, the people that study it day and night and study, you know, Talmud and the other texts is not everyone, but everyone has an opportunity. You don't have to be a member of some special class to get into that group.
Well, that's exactly his point, right? The exact point here was he wanted to speak to all the people. You know, if he wanted just this, you know, the elites to know about it or whatever, they could have done that in private. Right. They would have. But so they did this in public, you know, to satisfy the people's desire to know, you know Torah, to know the laws. And like it says there, that what God had asked them to do. And so this was you know, how they would begin to rebuild the society, which makes you think of, you know, when they wanted to, you know, many years later, rebuild Israel several times, but in the more, you know, recent innovation, it was the same thing. You know, we talked about the first thing they did was look to the Torah and say, okay, well, the Torah is telling us how to live in the land, so let's look at that and use its words and everything else to, you know, create our people, our lives here again.
And some of you will get a kick out of. I've been watching this scholar, a great scholar, on Jesus, Jewish scholar, and the organization behind him has T-shirts which are Jews for Exegesis, which which is fantastic, except it would be misinterpreted by almost everyone.
Who can pronounce it?
And obscure to almost everyone.
Well, not everyone can pronounce that word, and for a lot of people, it won't sound like what you think it sounds like.
Right, and exegesis means digging into the text to get meanings that are already there. It has nothing to do with you-know-who.
Jesus already has the meaning. You've already found him, sir.
So anyway, so I'm a Jew for exegesis, and but be careful when you quote me on that. So on that note, I will stop the recording.